Well, Alex, my memory of radio in the 80s is pretty good, even though there were some highs and some lows. I'd just love to know your opinion on how radio progressed in the 80s. Did it end up better towards the end of the 80s, or did it end up worse, or was it the same?
Well, it certainly wasn't the same. I think when we started, I started in '84, and I think you started 6 months after I did later that year, right?
Correct.
Yeah. We knew that from doing lots of live gigs that the music on Quad reflected what was really popular at the time. And Madonna was just becoming popular, so was Prince. So it was kind of a dance era type music, and you also had this influx of new wave music where all the artists each had their own sound.
Definitely.
So it was an exciting period, and I think that period, it actually kind of started around '83 with all the new wave stuff being injected in the top 40 music. So we got in right after that started happening, and it continued to about '85. Some might say '86, but by '87 things had changed.
In what way?
Well, it became more of a Janet Jackson format as opposed to just a broad mix of lots of different styles.
Oh, okay.
So by '87 you had Whitney Houston becoming really big, and Janet Jackson was really big, and then you had a lot of female pop dance artists really taking over the charts.
You know what, now that you mention it, I see that.
Yeah.
So it started becoming cookie cutter a little.
Yeah, and then not to put down the artists I mentioned, because I thought they were very talented, but after a while, if that's all you're listening to is the same formula over and over and over and over again, you start to ask questions. Is this ever going to change? Is this ever going to get back to the diversity that it once was? And part of the reason it changed, a lot of people are really, in the dark about how the radio industry works. They just assume that what happens on the charts is a reflection of what the public taste is. But what really happens is radio, especially at that time, was controlled by corporate forces. And in that case, back then, it was corporate consultants. They were slicing and dicing the formats so that the men ended up on the rock, listening to the rock station, which at the time was KZAP, and that was competing with 93 Rock, KRXQ. And then the women would be steered toward the pop dance stations, which at the time was FM 102, Croy, and Quad. So, Quad didn't have a consultant, but it followed what was going on in the industry. It has to do with economics. You see, the other stations had a lot of money behind them, and they could afford consultants who did the research to find out how to slice and dice the formats, whereas Quad just kind of followed what the industry did at that time. So by the end of the decade, which was 1989, everything had changed. Top 40 was no longer just the most popular stuff. It was kind of a slice of the mainstream, and it was the slice that reflected what the most active listeners were into, the ones who went to nightclubs and that kind of thing. Whereas there were other fragments that were popular, fragments of the mainstream that were popular that weren't being reflected on the Billboard Hot 100. Country became really big in the 80s, but you didn't see a lot of country songs on the Hot 100. And
you did even in the 70s.
Right, right. It was sprinkled in.
Right.
Even that's just another explanation why the Hot 100 isn't really the hottest music. It's just a slither of what's popular. And so the consultants controlled it so that certain audiences went to certain stations. And so pretty soon you just had these thin slicings of formats, and there was an expansion in the number of stations and the number of formats. So they call it the fragmentation of radio formats for that era, because formats began to divide. And as you recall, there was a smooth jazz format that came out of nowhere, and for years radio geniuses said that jazz will never work as a radio format. But when they started mixing it with pop, they created a smooth jazz format, and so it actually did become popular. So basically by the end of the decade you had a lot of different formats, but each one had its own cookie cutter sound, and so the labels started putting lots of sound-alike music out for each format. And so that was how the 80s ended up. Not to judge it too much that it became bland and horrible. I mean, because
but it kind of did.
There still was some good music coming out, but not as much. It was just more compressed.
And less of the good music was being played on the radio, maybe.
Yes, that's true.
Which is becoming more and more evident.
Which opened the door for alternative radio, but that's a whole other segment.
We'll look forward to that next interview soon.